After buying foods that meet the American Heart Association guidelines for fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and dietary fiber, then you can focus on the amount of carbohydrates you're consuming when you plan your meals at home. Carbohydrate counting is a very simple meal planning device that focuses only on carbohydrates. So, for this section, there won't be any comment on fats or proteins in your diet. We're only focusing on carbohydrates because these are the only foods that raise your glucose levels. In essence, carbohydrate counting identifies what a starting portion is for various types of carbohydrates and asks you to hold to a recommended number of servings or portions for each meal. Let's look at examples of the general amount of carbohydrates for each meal and snack. Often, the amount is based on your personal needs and your glucose control and not just calories. For instance, if there were two patients whose caloric needs were the same, for example 2,000 calories, the generally recommended amount of carbohydrates is generally 40% to 60% of their daily needs. However, what if one patient's glucose levels are averaging 320 milligrams per deciliter and the other is under good control, averaging around 120 milligrams per deciliter? Obviously, it would make sense that the person whose glucose levels are out of control, in the 300s, should have fewer carbohydrates at least for some time to try to get their glucose levels down as fast as possible. So, the amount of carbohydrates someone should have is not based solely on their caloric needs and never should be. Please check with your healthcare professional for the proper amount of carbohydrates for your unique situation. In general, we would recommend a female with diabetes not to exceed 3 portions of carbohydrates at breakfast, 3 or 4 at lunch, 4 at dinner, and 1 portion for each snack in the morning, afternoon, and evening if needed. For men, we would generally recommend 3 to 4 portions at breakfast, 4 at lunch, 4 to 5 at dinner, and 1 portion at each snack. Now remember, portions of carbohydrates are based not on calories, but how much glucose is in the food. 1 portion of carbohydrate is approximately 15 grams. These grams are not a unit of weight, but the amount of glucose in a food. There is no need to buy a gram scale and weigh carbohydrates. The gram units are not to confuse you, but to help you with foods you buy in the grocery store and have a food label on them. Carbohydrates are listed on the food labels in grams. So each portion of a carbohydrate is 15 grams, which is to say that each portion of a carbohydrate has about 15 grams of glucose in it. Thus, all carbohydrates have about the same amount of glucose and would raise your blood glucose about the same. For years, people had thought that some carbohydrates raise glucose levels higher than others. This is not true. The saying we often use is that a carb is a carb is a carb. But you have to compare apples to apples. 1 slice of bread raises glucose levels as much as 3/4 cup of cornflakes, as 1/2 cup of mashed potatoes, as 3 cups of popped reduced fat popcorn, as 1/3 cup of cooked rice, as 1 cup of skim milk, as 1/2 cup of orange juice, as 2 regular Oreo cookies, and so on. The grams, again, are used to help you determine how many carbohydrates are in a serving of the food you bring home. As you can see, 1 portion of carbohydrates is approximately 15 grams, so 2 portions are 30 grams, 3 portions are 45 grams, etc. Remember, except for snacks, which I would recommend to be no more than 20 grams, you can have more than 1 portion of carbohydrates at each meal. And remember to hold to 3 to 4 portions at breakfast and lunch, and no more than 4 portions for women at dinner, and no more than 5 portions for men. These are suggested amounts. And remember, your particular situation could add more or less based on your circumstances. When you're planning or preparing your meals at home, you have responsibility to moderate the amount of carbohydrates at each meal and snack as well. Remember to spread your carbohydrates throughout the day in small amounts and not to have 2 to 3 large meals, but instead have 5 small meals with moderate amounts of carbohydrates at each meal. You will have less variance in your glucose levels, and over time, glucose levels that will be more consistent without as many severe lows and highs. So focus not on fewer carbohydrates, but a consistent amount. It is better over time to eat similar amounts of carbohydrates for each meal and snack at similar times each day than to have too many carbohydrates one day and too few the next. Often your glucose levels are all over the place when you're inconsistent with the amount and time of carbohydrates you eat each day.